Welcome back to Torah on the Go. Whether you are on the Peloton, walking your dog, or taking a break at work, we are glad that you have taken a moment to study Torah with me and Rabbi Feinstein.
Good afternoon, good morning, and good evening.
Well, last week we studied the burning bush episode, and this week we take a look at Moses re-entering Egypt. Moses is sent by God with Aaron on a mission to come back to Egypt. And it's not lost on me that we call Moses Moshe Rabbeinu. Moses, our rabbi, our teacher. He is considered by the rabbinic tradition to be the first of the rabbis. And in this moment, in his re-entrance into the Egyptian landscape, it's not unlost on me that he has what I think is the first meeting with the Jewish committee, okay? Before approaching Pharaoh, before walking into the palace. The Torah tells us, I'm reading in Exodus chapter 4, verse 29, Vayasfu et kol ziknei b'nei Yisrael. They gathered together all of the elders of the children of Israel. And Moses and Aaron had to introduce themselves and had to explain to them everything that they had experienced. And this comes only 2 or 3 verses before he stands iconically before Pharaoh and says, Shlach et ami, right? Let my people go. Right. So before he gets the job, even though God tells him, you're the one, I'm going to send you, and as you lift up your arms, plagues are going to come and special effects, and I'm going to break all of nature with your staff and your words and blah, blah, blah. He first has to interview with the elders. How do you think that meeting went? And do you spend as much time thinking about that meeting? And what questions could they possibly have for Moses?
Rabbi Leibowitz, I think that your experience as a young rabbi being interviewed by boards and committees has gotten to you and gotten to your soul.
Maybe.
I think we need to cure you, brother. I think a little emunah shlema would help here. First of all, that there are ziknei b'nei Yisrael, which means there's a social structure. That they are slaves, but they're not totally, diffuse and atomized. There is a social structure. There is a Jewish community with a leadership. That's amazing. That slavery has not eroded the sense of solidarity of the community, its social structure, its ability to make a decision. Second of all, so Moses shows up in front of this committee.
Yeah.
Who is he? Who the heck is he?
He's clearly not one of the Ziknei B'nai Yisrael.
Well, he's not one of them. That's
right.
The point. First of all, he was born into slavery, and maybe up until the age of 3 or 5 or 7, he had a relationship with his mother. But then he was raised in the palace. So does he speak their language? Literally and figuratively, does he speak their language? Then he spent 40 years in the desert as a Midianite shepherd. So he don't look like them. He doesn't act like them. He doesn't dress like them. And he shows up with this message, which is completely out of this world. I've been sent by the God of your ancestors to liberate you from Pharaoh's slavery. Who the heck are you? Right. And why would God send you of all people? You're not even one of us.
That's right.
And how can you promise this? How can you promise us freedom? And then I think that the interesting next question is the confrontation of those two worldviews. He's a man of freedom. He can imagine freedom. He knows freedom. He can imagine that the status quo, the way things are, isn't the way it inevitably must be. They, on the other hand, are slaves. They can't imagine anything different. Not only are they slaves physically, they're slaves mentally, cognitively. And he shows up. Think of all the things that keep us stuck in a place, in a way of thinking, that keep us from imagining what might be. They have all of those forces holding them, as it were, down, and he's trying to raise them up. Must have been a hell of an encounter.
Absolutely.
What an encounter.
And if you look throughout Jewish history at the tremendous lows, you look at there were leadership groups in the ghetto that the Nazis used to deal with, whether those groups were strong and defended the Jewish people in the case of the Warsaw Ghetto, or whether those groups were undermining and destructive in their own right. If you look at the Lodz Ghetto, there was the French Sanhedrin in the French Revolution. There have always been groups throughout the Jewish history. We can study each of the episodes where there have been these committees. This group comes along and they meet Moses face to face. And like you're saying, must carry a different worldview.
Sure.
Must carry a different worldview. And they sit down and they hear his plan. And then he walks before Pharaoh. And the Torah gives us no description of this moment. Meaning to say, this moment that's been portrayed in cinema as this powerful encounter between Moses and Pharaoh, that the whole Torah builds to. We know this is coming. We have no description of what the palace is like, no description of what Pharaoh is like, no description of where Moses stands, no description of where Aaron stands. Moses stands before Pharaoh and says, "Shlach et ami ve'achogu li bamidbar." Let my people go so that they may worship, so that they may have a holiday in the desert. Mm-hmm. That's the initial ask. It's not, let my people go so they may be free forever and ever and ever, and we're not coming back. It's, we need a holiday. We've been slaves for a long time. Give us a few days to go have a festival in the desert. And Pharaoh hears this, and his response is, who is this God? Who are you? What is happening here?
Who are you?
Right? And he says, famously, let them make bricks without straw, right? Let's take away all of the processes that we had before. The amount of bricks, the quantity of bricks shall remain the same. Now the work will be even harsher. Moses and Aaron come back to the same committee. This is the end of this episode. They come back to the same committee. The committee cannot believe.
Right. What have you done?
What have you done?
What have you done?
You've made our lives worse.
Right.
Not better. You've made our lives much worse.
Right. Right. So first of all, the first thing is you're exactly right. The movies show us that scene when Moses enters the palace as this glorious cinematic and the long-lost son is coming back. First of all, if you've ever gone to a government office to get something done, right, the first thing is there's a line.
Right.
Like, did he wait in line for 2 hours before he got in? You take a number and you wait, right? Nowadays you call and they tell you, And then number two, he gets there in front of Pharaoh. And I don't know if Pharaoh recognizes him. It's been 40 years since they threw him out of Egypt or he left Egypt. And even if he recognizes him, they were not on exactly good terms when they left.
Right.
Right? So he's standing there and he's this guy from the desert. So he's not exactly dressed in a Brooks Brothers coat and tie. And he says, I've been sent by this God who you've never heard of, who wants his people to worship him at a place which is way the hell out in the desert. Like Pharaoh says, who are you?
Right.
Who are you? I entertain kings. I entertain emperors. I entertain generals. Just some desert prophet showing up. And then when he makes it clear that he's coming on behalf of the slave community, they say, well, the slaves have too much time on there. They're starting to imagine freedom.
Right.
We have to push it down, right? And that response, exactly right, when they go back. It calls to mind when Martin Luther King began his campaign. When he was in the Birmingham jail, the resistance was not only from the Southern racists, the white racists, the resistance was from the African-American community. The Southern African-American ministers wrote to him and said, stop making trouble. You're making it worse for us. Who do you think you are? This 28-year-old, rabble-rouser. We have it's not good, but at least it's stable. You're making it unstable, and that's not healthy for our community. It's dangerous what you're doing. Any kind of prophet, anybody who comes to change the status quo, meets the resistance of that conservative voice that says, I don't like what it is, but I'm terrified of what it might be.
Right. The devil you know is better than the devil you don't.
Exactly.
And here we see that the Jewish people themselves perhaps are not as ready for freedom. One could ask by reading the narrative, and I have in front of the congregation, Moses, when he runs away from Egypt, there is nobody stopping him.
Right.
So what stops the whole Jewish people from just walking out one day?
And Aaron comes to meet him.
So
Aaron walks out of Egypt.
It seems to be open borders seem to be a reality that they're living in. And so the question of what is stopping the Jewish community from getting up in the morning one morning and simply walking out of Egypt?
The mental prison of being a slave.
That's right. That's right. They're conditioned. They're conditioned at this point in the narrative to be slaves. And someone stands before them and stands before Pharaoh and says, we can break this condition. We can simply find the strength within ourselves. God is calling us to rise up in this moment and walk out, and they can't wrap their minds around it. They're not ready.
No, I think we talked about this in the previous episode. The Gerer Rebbe, the Sfas Emet, great Hasidic teacher of the late 19th, early 20th century, has this comment where he says, the worst part of slavery is not the physical bondage. The worst part of slavery is the mental, the cognitive bondage. A slave thinks of himself as a slave and can't imagine anything else. A slave lives in the present tense. A slave can't imagine a tomorrow that's any different than yesterday. And so the slave says, the slave ultimately doesn't even know that he's a slave, because this is what he is. There's no alternative. There's no contrast. And this guy shows up, and he stands before the people, and he's like them, but he's not like them. He looks like them, because genetically he's one of them, but he talks like somebody else, and his mannerisms, his demeanor, he's a free man. And the Gerer says it's that contrast. When they see Moses, they began to wake up from the stupor of their slavery, and they say, we are slaves. My God, we are slaves. Their first response when he says, I've come to liberate you, they say, from what? And he says, you're slaves. And at first they resist that, and slowly they wake up, and it's painful to realize that. And they suddenly begin to realize that maybe there is a tomorrow that is possible.
And this leads to one of the first painful moments with Moses. Moses turns to God and says, why would you do this to me?
Yes.
Why would you send me here to fail?
Right.
I didn't want this job to begin with, right? I didn't want to come here. You came to me. I said no. I said no 3 times. You forced me to do this. You convinced me to do this. I came here and I failed. And Moses, hey, I thought we were buddies.
Right.
You told me your name.
Right.
We're on a first name basis. And God says to Moses, just wait. Just wait. You will see how this will unfold so quickly before you.
Yeah.
And that is a message that that kind of patience is difficult for humanity. The idea that change comes slowly.
Right.
But that's actually one of the profound messages in this narrative, is that change isn't accomplished overnight.
Yeah. He doesn't have a superpower.
Right.
I mean, God doesn't make him faster than a speeding bullet or more powerful than a locomotive and able to leap tall buildings at a single bound. God doesn't make Moses Superman. He doesn't even give him charisma. He doesn't even make him convincing, because no one listens to him. Because, exactly right, because this is a process, and the process is twofold. The process is loosening Pharaoh's grip on power and on this people. And the process is growing a soul in this people, growing a sense that tomorrow we can be different, we can be better, we can move. Growing that sense is going to take time.
Right. And it seems like God understands that this has to happen in stages, not only for Moses to grow as a leader, not only for Egypt to recognize that Israel has to walk out, but actually for the children of Israel to gain the strength themselves, the strength of character, to follow Moses out of Egypt. Mm-hmm. I'm always surprised that Moses doesn't just stand up and walk out of Egypt at this point. He had done it once before. This feels like this is the lowest point for him. I always feel like this moment feels to me like I'm not sure if this is the right kind of plan. Moses, though, has a certain kind of faith in God's plan. He has it all throughout the Torah. It always feels to me like this is, if I could be Moses' defense attorney for just a minute, when he gets punished for striking the rock, I would say, man without faith, what are you talking about? There's so many moments where he could have simply abandoned the plan and walked away.
Right.
And he didn't do it. He chose to stick with the plan and to stick with God as his partner in changing the world.
And conversely, Havdil, as they say, conversely, Pharaoh doesn't put him in jail. Right? The sheriff in Birmingham, Alabama, put Martin Luther King in jail and did it again and again and again. And eventually they killed him. Pharaoh doesn't kill Moses, and Pharaoh doesn't jail Moses. Why not? Because because he knew that when Moses went back to the committee, they were going to tear him apart. And as long as the Israelites were beating each other up, right, Pharaoh could control them. So in some sense, he becomes a tool of Pharaoh's control, even against his own will, because he knew Pharaoh could see that this was going to cause dissension among the slaves, and the easiest way to put down the rebellion is to let them put it down themselves. Let their own conservative prejudices, their fear, let their own fear continue to bind them.
When Moses leaves the palace and brings back this awful news, the Jewish people are in disarray.
Disarray and despair.
Despair.
It just got worse.
Right. It's gotten worse.
It just got worse.
So in this moment, we often try to look for portraits of leadership that aren't the top of the mountain. It's not Moses receiving the Ten Commandments.
Right.
I think of the portrait of John Kennedy that hangs in the White House, of him in contemplative thought. How many times leaders must kind of stand alone. The movie High Noon, Gary Cooper. Leaders must stand alone and decide that they're going to push forward.
You ever been to the Lincoln Memorial?
I have.
In Washington?
Yeah.
I think it's the holiest place in the United States of America.
That's interesting.
I think that I stand there with just a sense of reverence.
Right.
And you look up at that enormous statue of Lincoln, and he's alone. And he's looking out forward, looking out at the mall at Washington. But you can see the pain on his face, the loneliness. This man was the loneliest man in American history. He believed in the Union. He believed in America. He believed in the emancipation. He believed nobody was with him.
That's right.
You know, Doris Kearns Goodwin's book is about the cabinet were all the people who hated him. He brought them close so he could control them or at least keep an eye on them. Just this lonely man who really believed he had God's truth on his side and was doing the right thing, that he was on God's side, as he would say. And you stand there and you look up at that statue and you realize what it means to be that kind of a visionary leader at that moment, and how many moments of despair did Lincoln have to overcome in order for us to have this, right? And how many moments did Moses have to overcome in order for us to be us?
Right. And I think it would be a really compelling, we do a debate every high holidays. Maybe this year we'll debate holier sites in America, national monuments or baseball stadiums. Which are the holiest cathedrals that we have in this country?
Yeah, that's a tough call.
It's
that's
a tough call.
Fenway and Wrigley against the Lincoln Memorial,
right, in Dodger Stadium and Yankee Stadium. Right.
Yosemite Valley. I don't know
how many thousands of people visit each one. We could study. We could bring research to it. Anyway, we can't start thinking about high holidays just yet, or I'll lose my mind. So thank you for joining us. We are so glad you got a chance to study Torah with us, and we look forward to studying with you next week. Wherever you are right now in your lives, whether you're home or whether you're not yet back in your home, we hope that you find the resources that you need. And if there's anything that you need, whether it be through Valley Beth Shalom, through our counseling center, through our clergy, please reach out and contact us and be in touch.